Okay, our talk this morning centers on another classic text, Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 to 28, with its theme being the importance of escaping the self. The self, our culture's favorite subject. One way or another, almost everything these days is about the self. I'm a Calvin and Hobbes fan. I think the cartoonist Bill Watterson is a genius. For those of you who may not be familiar with this comic, it tells tales of the irascible, impish kid Calvin and his stuffed tiger colleague Hobbes. You can take to be real or not, but Calvin, it's this internal dialogue that now goes on between Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin is all, using Freudian terms, Calvin is all id, and Hobbes is, I think, of more of his superego. And Friday I came across this cartoon. Hobbes comes upon Calvin outside playing in the snow, building a snowman, and he asks, "Aren't you supposed to be doing homework now?" And Calvin replies, "I quit doing homework. Homework is bad for my self-esteem." Hobbes says, "It is." Calvin, "Sure, it sends the message that I don't know enough. All that emphasis on right answers makes me feel bad when I get it wrong. So instead of trying to learn, I'm just concentrating on liking myself the way I am." Hobbes comes back, "Your self-esteem is enhanced by remaining an ignoramus." Well, we turn to the gospel and we find there, according to Jesus, that flourishing life begins with denying yourself. And immediately we will protest, right? We can't love others until we've learned to love ourselves, right? And there is a truth to that. And I am going to suggest that we learn to be kind to ourselves. Some of us aren't. We aren't at all kind to ourselves. We're demanding, critical, and impatient with ourselves. And one close look at our frantic, hectic lives tells us that it's past time to quit being so hard on ourselves and to start being kind. So God, I think, is saying to each one of us, I love you. By all means, love yourselves. And I've given a lot of thought in my life to the whole matter of self-love. Then one day, several years ago, I was on a walk and I was struggling with myself. And these words came to me, a bit from the text we're looking at this morning and some from something that Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 19. But these were the words: "There is no hole inside me that God does not fill, if I just remember. May my times of forgetting be less and less until they are no more. May I so empty myself that I may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God." And this too has become something I recite to myself pretty much every day. And Malachi, in his prayer, you may had a phrase in there that caught exactly what I'm talking about. There is no hole inside me that God does not fill if I just remember. May my times of forgetting be less and less until they are no more. May I so empty myself that I will be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Emptying myself. Now to our text this morning with a look first at its context. It follows Peter's confession to Jesus that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, in chapter 16, verse 16. Peter scores big. We read then beginning in verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. From that time on. And with this verse, we come to a turning point in Matthew's gospel and in Jesus' life. And we become aware quickly that all this stuff in the Sermon on the Mount, back in chapters 5 to 7, is not in the least theoretical. It's not peripheral. It's not, well, nice if you get to it, but it's not theoretical. Turning the other cheek, going the second mile, trusting God whatever happens, forgiving again and again and again, not giving in to anger, and quitting the tendency to always be judging one another and everyone else. These are not platitudes. They're part of the fabric of life itself, so much so that we won't make it without these truths. I won't. You won't. Our society won't. Our nation won't. They're the key to life itself. And now for Jesus very personally, they become primal truths. Peter, newly designated rock man, in the verses just before, that's what Peter means, really, rocky. Peter doesn't get it. In fact, he hates what he's hearing and he rebukes Jesus. Never, Lord, this will never happen to you. All this talk about suffering, never. You're the Messiah. Yours is the power and the glory. Now, Jesus has heard that voice before, back in time, out in the wilderness of Judea. Remember his temptations? And so he turns to Peter in verse 23, the verse right before the text, and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Because, Peter, there is no way but the way of the cross. There is no way but the way of the emptied Christ. Flourishing life doesn't happen any other way. Only the cross can heal humanity's brokenness. Only the cross. Life works exactly the opposite of what a lot of people suppose. The power is in sacrificial love, always. It's in the worst moments in your life. It's in death itself. And so Jesus says in verse 24, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself." He must renounce self as the center of life and action. He must renounce self as the center of the universe. And of course, this goes against almost everything our culture, and especially our culture here in America, tells us. There may have never been an age so focused on self as ours. We practically worship self. And yet, what is self? You ever wonder about that? Quick, try to describe your real self, the core you. What exactly is it? Quick, I ask, who are you? But no, who are you really, and what do you answer? What exactly is the self? Is it your name, your age, your gender, your job, what you do for a living, your fears, your dreams, your beliefs, or even your behavior patterns? Is it your personality? What is the core you? Any ideas here? So we have built a whole culture on this thing called self when we have very little idea what it even is. John Kabat-Zinn, in his book, classic book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, introduces the concept of selfing. Selfing is the way that we construct out of almost everything in every situation an I, a me, and a mine, and then operate in the world from that limited perspective, which turns out to be mostly fantasy and defense. Now, if you really think about it, you will see, he says, that what we call the self is a construct of our mind, and hardly a permanent one either. This I construct is constantly dissolving and reconstructing itself, always slightly differently, virtually moment by moment. And so it's no wonder that we so easily feel put down or diminished, small, insecure, and uncertain, since the existence of self is so fragile. Do you begin to see the problem? Jesus is saying for life to take off, become radiant, sacred, transcendent, you have to shift the spiritual center of gravity off yourself. You can't be thinking all the time, why me? Why is this happening to me? How could they do this to me? Thinking that way, and I think most of us kind of know this, but thinking that way is a prescription for misery. Every really unhappy person sees every conversation, every encounter, every relationship only from their own perspective. And Jesus is saying that it doesn't work. Now, he is not saying to hate yourself. He is not suggesting that we should have a poor self-image. He is suggesting, I think, that most of the time we be so little focused on ourselves, so focused on God, so centered on God, so little focused on ourselves that we can't feel poorly about ourselves. It would never occur to us to think poorly of ourselves. And then in verse 25, he begins to work off of the Greek word psyche, which is an ambiguous, complicated word, translated, it's a Greek word, translated in English by life or soul or self. Go figure how one word can mean all those things, but it does. In fact, the NIV translates it in our text, translates it as life in verse 25, and then twice as soul in verse 26. But in all four cases, it's the same Greek word, psyche. I notice that the NRSV updated version has life all four times. That at least recognizes that it's the same word all four times. Here's what Jesus says. For whoever wants to save his psyche, his life, his self, will lose it. But whoever loses his psyche, his life, his self for me, will find it. Meaning that a person can only achieve full life when he or she no longer clings to it in that tight-fisted kind of way, or that a person can only find his or herself when he or she is no longer absorbed by it. It's kind of what Bette Midler in a song quite a while ago, The Rose, was getting at. It's the heart afraid of breaking that never learns to dance. It's the dream afraid of waking that never takes a chance. It's the one who won't be taken, who cannot seem to give. And the soul afraid of dying that never learns to live. And this is universally, timelessly true. The very best things in life you never get by aiming directly at them. And that's another thing most of us know. Or you never keep them if you hold desperately on to them, whether it be happiness or peace or the love of another person. And so it is with this fragile, lovely little thing called the self or the soul. Meanwhile, we live out an ancient story told around the campfires of ancient Greece. It's the tale of Narcissus, who saw his own image in a pool one day, his own image, and instantly fell in love with it. He became obsessed with his own perfection. And so he kept looking at himself in the water's mirror, always looking at himself, and slowly he wasted away and died. Like Narcissus, we become obsessed with our own image, and we have no room in our minds to really fully love anyone else. We devote so much of our time and energy to defending our own perfection, to masking our own scandals and vulnerabilities, explaining away our imperfections, and reacting angrily or fearfully to every imagined slight. Our every disappointment or setback becomes catastrophic. And we would rather lose, too often, we would rather lose our children, lose our friends, lose our church, even lose our faith than to have our image tarnished. We do this as individuals, and we do it as a nation. And slowly our life force wastes away. And of course, we never really discover the story in which we actually can find ourselves. The timeless story, the forever story of which our life stories are just a part. We never knowingly touch eternal life that's all around us all the time. And the truth is, and it's taught in all the world literature and mythology, that in every culture, the really creative acts are understood to involve some kind of dying to self. Now, deep down inside, we've always known that. Jim Collins, in his book, Good to Great, Why Some Companies Make the Leap and Others Don't, identified 11 companies who had outperformed the market almost 7 times over a period of 15 years. 11 companies that had outperformed the market almost 7 times over a period of 15 years. And he found that in every case, their leaders were self-effacing, quiet, reserved, even shy, and that they hardly ever talked about themselves. It's not quite what most people expect. Jesus goes on in verse 26, "What good will it be for a person if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul, his psyche, his real life, his inner life? What matters is this inner life that is created step by step by doing good things, small acts of kindness, sometimes heroic sacrifices, but way more often just a cup of cold water given, an encouraging word, a smile, a judgment withheld, a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, a mercy extended, a wrong forgiven, so that step by step a great soul is created. And the real story in which we can finally find ourselves is discovered. But what happens, Jesus says in verse 26, if a person gains the whole world? If he's Alexander the Great and one day he discovers there's no one home inside? You find yourself by losing yourself. by getting out from under the pressure of having the details of your own life be central to the operation of the universe, so that every outcome, decision, success, and failure seems so deadly important. Only the soul, set free from agonizing self-consciousness, is fully free to explore and participate in the world beyond the self. And you think about that, and you know that's true too. Only such a soul is free to see, to understand, and to fully love. A lot of this, I admit, is aspirational, but it's the right aspiration. As long as you're obsessed with your own security or your own reputation, or how you come across, or even your own spiritual journey, you are not available either to give yourself to others or even to be kind to yourself. On the other hand, the mature soul is animated by trust. And it is this that sets him or her free from restrictive self-consciousness. Now she or he can be underappreciated or undervalued or even criticized unfairly, and will stay calm, centered in God's loving presence. But only when we are loosened from the bondage, the tyranny of our own egos, are we truly free. Only then can we live in the moment, understanding, enjoying the moment without needing to hold on to it. Only then can we feel happiness without knowing that that happiness just has to continue. So we go on vacation, right? You arrive one day with a whole glorious week ahead of you. The first day is great, as is the second and the third. The fourth day, the nagging little thought enters your head that there are only 3 days really left, and then it's only 2 days left, and then, well, you see where this goes. Now suppose we each got ourselves and all of our fears and anxiety, we got out of them, that to go with the fears and anxieties that go with all that. And suppose we got all of that out of the way and we really lived in the moment. Even that last morning, that drive back, could be great. And that's what Guy was driving at in class this morning when he said, it's not just the destination, it's the journey that's wonderful. But it is only when we are loosened from the bondage, the tyranny of our own egos, that we can recapture that feeling we had as a child when we woke up and morning smiled every morning. It's to remember that there is no hole inside me that God does not fill. If I just remember. May my times of forgetting be less and less until they are no more. May I so empty myself that I may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Remember how we were once enchanted by the most ordinary things. Do you remember that first box of colored crayons? Do you remember your first leaf collection? Do you remember when life was magic simply because you took things just as they were? John Kabat-Zinn also writes that if you stop trying to make yourself into more than you are, out of fear that you are less than you are, whoever you really are will be a lot lighter and happier and easier to live with too. And you will start to discover, through the way of the emptied Christ, flourishing life, transcendent life, forever life, radiant life. It all begins with escaping the self and reaching out to others. And when we do these things, when we reach out to others, we create a self, an inner life, a soul that has character, and a soul that is finally set free. That's the call this morning, to find ourselves by losing ourselves. It's a paradox, but it's true. In fact, that's the beginning, and I say this almost in passing, but it's true that this is the meaning and shape and texture of baptism. It's a conscious, death-defying burial in water in which you lose your life so that you may live again. We reenact Jesus' dying and rising, and we die and rise again. In fact, it embodies all of life's deepest truths. We die to self. We rise to a new life, transformed, radiant, liberated, and free finally to live in the moment, to love others, to be kind to ourselves, and to discover flourishing life. May each of us realize there is no hole inside you that God does not fill if you just remember. May your times of forgetting be less and less until they are no more. May you so empty yourself that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Following in the way of the emptied Christ, the emptied self, with room now made for the fullness that can only come from God.